All right, welcome, students of the Emergence of Bangladesh course. This is a short version of the first lecture for the Emergence of Bangladesh course, entitled Bengal from the 7th century of the Common Era to the eve of the Battle of Plassey. And I'm one of your course instructors, Dr. Tahsin Ali. And I'm sharing with you the PowerPoint slides, which will be given to you on your student learning platform, the BUX system. Now, let's begin. Now, we are not going to spend too much time as it is. This is a short version of this lecture. If you look at this slide, this is just to give you an idea of the political situation in the years leading up to the first emergence, if you like, of a Bengali entity. But before we get to that, as you can see on this map, these are the two important central or centralized kingdoms or empires which existed in the Indian subcontinent, which incorporated the present-day regions of West Bengal in the state of, West Bengal in the Republic of India, and of course the present-day country of Bangladesh. And so you can see on the map. So just peripherally, if you look at the map, you actually have the modern day countries of the Indian subcontinent imposed on this map, showing the Maurya dynasty in approximately the 3rd century before the Common Era. And again, this is just to give you an idea of the situation. Now, after the Mauryas, you have the Guptas, and this is another map. This is the second map on your PowerPoint slides. This map shows you the Guptas in approximately the 5th century of the Common Era, or AD, from the Anno Domini, the other version of dating, which we don't usually use nowadays. We generally use the Common Era or before the Common Era. So anyway, so this is to show you the Gupta Empire in approximately the 5th century of the Common Era, and you have an idea that the Guptas incorporated the Bengal region into the periphery of their empire, and certainly from the records, excavations, and other evidence that we have, inscriptions, so on and so forth. Certainly, you do have some centers of urbanization, a few centers of learning in the Bengal region during the age of the Guptas. Now, the Guptas or the Gupta Empire sort of begins to disintegrate in and around the 6th century into the 6th century of the Common Era, around that time into the 7th century of the Common Era. And it is out of this disintegration of this second great centralized entity or kingdom or empire in the Indian subcontinent, based out of the Gangetic Plains, that you are going to see the emergence of the contours, the outlines of what can be defined as Bengal. All right. Two names that have been used to define Bengal: Gaur and Bengal. And what is interesting is that the word Bengal actually denotes East Bengal, which eventually after 1971, as you know, is going to become the present day country of Bangladesh. Here, I have another map for you. This is just to show you, again, without going into specifics, this is just to give you an idea of the contours of the region of Bengal. And there were a number of different Bengals. There were a number of different Bengals from, again, there were as many as 3, 4, 5, as many as 6 Bengals during these times. Here is another map, sort of moving ahead. This is to give you an idea. Again, you can see on the eastern side and on the western side, different regional entities which could claim and which did claim to be part, can claim, excuse me, to be part of the Bengal region. So for instance, you can see on the map here, Bikrampur, for instance, is one of those ancient Bengals or Bengali entities that you can refer to. Now, one of the, again, from the sources that we have, the first sort of king or ruler in the Bengal region who is going to sort of set out the boundaries of this modernizing Bengal, this evolving Bengal, is going to be Shashanka, right? And so here you have this map here. And so again, this is an approximation, but what is clear is that this is still not the contours of modern Bengal. And let me just remind you again that by modern Bengal, we mean the Bengal that, that today, in the present day, is defined as the state of West Bengal in the Republic of India, and the present day country of Bangladesh, which was East Bengal. So, but you have the outlines of, you have the beginnings of the outline of this Bengal headed by Shashanka, right? And here is another map, and this is post Shashanka. We can talk about that later on. Moving on to one of our other slides. Our next slide. So who was Shashanka? Again, from the sources that we have, he may have been a subject king of the Guptas before he asserts his rule in the Bengal region. And again, we do have a few contemporary sources from the time. There's a lot of there are a lot of things happening in flux in this region, a lot of back and forth, but for the few decades that Shashanka rules this Gaur and Bengal region, it's a landmark moment, right? It's a landmark moment in the establishment of the political and geographic Bengal that we would recognize later, right? The contours are still not there, but they come into being after Shashanka. And let me make another point, which is that Shashanka was a Sanskrit-speaking king of Bengal, if you like. Next, and so after Shashanka, in approximately in the 630s of the Common Era, you have a disintegration of this political entity until approximately about 100 years or so later, you once again have the emergence of a new dynasty, the Pal dynasty, a Buddhist Bengali dynasty in the Bengal region. And it's from this time onward that we begin to have a definite sense of the chronology of time. Again, you have centers of learning thriving once again. You have centers of urbanization. And sort of moving along quickly, from the Pal, you then have the Sens, who are a Hindu Bengali Hindu dynasty who emerge as the rulers of the Bengal region after the Buddhist Pal dynasty. And again, they may have been subject kings, they may have been local chieftains, but nevertheless, they assert their rule in the Bengal region once the Pal dynasty falls apart. Now, moving along into the late 1100s, early 1200s, you now have sort of moving to the northwestern portion of the Indian subcontinent. You already have had the arrival of Muslims, Muslim groups, Muslim entities, Muslim incursions, whichever term you want to use, into the Sindh region, the present-day Sindh region of the Indian subcontinent, and from the northwestern portion of the Indian subcontinent further north, you have the arrival of Turkic Muslims, right? So, and they are now going to establish themselves in Delhi, and this is going to become known as the age of the Delhi Sultanates. This is going to become known as the age of the Delhi Sultanates. And the Delhi Sultanates are now going to send explorers, military generals to explore the Indians, the further east in the Indian subcontinent, and this is going to bring them. Into the Bengal region. Looking at my next slide here, we are now into part 2 of the lecture. And this is the advent or arrival of Islam in Bengal. It is a moment of transformation. You have mass conversions, particularly of lower caste, primarily lower caste Bengali Hindus to Islam. There are some conversions amongst Bengali Buddhists as well. And a lot of this is facilitated certainly in the early stages by adherents of Sufism, right, which is a distinct sort of personalized approach to Islam, and the Sufist message of universal brotherhood and equality, and this is what helps transform the religious landscape in Bengal during this time. Let me mention this as well, not necessarily in chronological order, but just for the sake of time, that you also now have the gradual evolution of Bengali, the gradual evolution of Bengali, right, the Bengali language as it evolves from the elite Sanskrit, which had been spoken by the social elites, if you like, of the various regions of the Indian subcontinent, including Bengal. But now you gradually begin to see the breaking away of this variation, which is eventually going to become Bengali. This is going to be helped by the translations of the great Hindu epics, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, into Bengali. And so, and at the same time, you also have, with the arrival of Turkic, Persian, Muslim influences, you have the introduction of a variety of different new words into this localized language, which is being spoken, which is eventually going to become Bengali. And so, and you see traces of those influences right down to the present day. There are a number of social, religious, cultural transformations taking place as well. For instance, during and around the age of the ruler Hussein Shah in Bengal, you have the rise of Vaishnavism which sort of situates itself, right? Vaishnavism essentially is, again, a more direct relationship, all right, creating more direct relationship with, right, with the Supreme Godhead. Um, I would say it's a middle ground. It's sort of a middle ground between between caste Hinduism and Islam, right? So this is a movement which sort of and the reason why we can say that is because Vaishnavism draws in people from both the Islamic faith by this time in the late 15th, early 16th centuries, and from caste Hinduism as well, right? So that's why we can say that Vaishnavism sort of situates itself as a middle ground. It is in many ways a transformative and liberating force as well. For instance, although without overemphasizing its importance, what we can say is that Vaishnavism also, in its rituals of participation, allows women to participate as well outside the domestic sphere. And this is going to be important because certainly in the Bengal region, you're not going to see this type of participation by women again until well into the 19th century. So again, without overstating that point, sort of making that reference that about the participation of women. With the arrival of Islam in Bengal, you have the idea was that these generals and military adventurers sent out from the Delhi Sultanates would rule on behalf of the different sultanates which were established at Delhi. That doesn't happen. Again, it's a very complicated discussion. We don't have time for this, at least in this class. Suffice it to say, what essentially happens is that you're going to begin to see the establishment of what are going to become known as the Bengal Sultanates. So you have these military adventurers, rulers, or excuse me, governors who are going to declare their independence in Bengal from Delhi. Right? And so that's why you can call them either quasi or fully independent rulers of Bengal. Moving ahead into the early 1500s of the Common Era, you begin to see the gradual disintegration of the Bengal Sultanates, and another major event has already taken place in 1526, which is the arrival of the Mughals, the arrival of Prince Babur in Delhi. He defeats the last of the Delhi Sultanates, the House of Lodi, and establishes what is going to become the Mughal dynasty in the Indian subcontinent. And there is on this slide here, as you can see, I have referenced the Sher Shah interregnum, which is this sort of rule between, you may be familiar with this, sort of this rule between rule of this prominent individual, Sher Shah, between the reigns of Babur and his son Humayun. And so after Babur returns, of course, the next, perhaps the most important of the Mughals is going to be the Emperor Akbar. And it's during the age of Akbar that you're going to see the absorption of post-Sultanate Bengal into Mughal India, right? So for instance, here is another map to give you an idea of the gradual expansion and absorption of different regions of the Indian subcontinent under the reign of the Emperor Akbar. And you can see in the differentiation in the colors how this happens. Again, just to talk briefly, so the Mughals established themselves after Babur. and 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 so they have, of course, they have linkages, they have relations with present-day Afghanistan and beyond, but they decide to make their home in the Indian subcontinent. Um, Now let's talk about the Emperor Akbar. Now Akbar is significant. He's considered one of the perhaps greatest rulers in South Asian history, in the sense that during his administration, his reign, he touched on every aspect of governance, almost every aspect of life. In the Indian subcontinent, he was a patron of the arts, of culture, learning, and he is also significant, of course, for trying to create a syncretic religion which would unite all the different religious communities in the Indian subcontinent: Hindus, Muslims, Shia Muslims, Jains, Christians. And he removes the tax on non-Muslims. Removes the tax on non-Muslims, which had been imposed in the Indian subcontinent, beginning with the Delhi Sultanates. And so that, again, sort of gives you an idea of his attempt to try and create a pluralistic society where everyone could participate in life freely in the Indian subcontinent under the rule of the Mughals. Let me mention one point about, now there is going to be resistance in Bengal, since we are focused on Bengal. There is going to be resistance in Bengal to accept Mughal supremacy. And here's a point of notable interest, is that you have the local chieftains, regional area chieftains in Bengal, who are both Hindus and Muslims, who joined together to initially resist the Mughals. And the entire region of Bengal does not come under complete Mughal control until sort of around 1584, 1585. 86, around that period. There are a few, again, without going into specific details, there are a number of sort of last-ditch efforts to try and hold on to an entity of some sort. Now, once Bengal becomes part of Mughal India, it's during this time that the economic policies implemented by the Mughal emperors or the Mughal administrators is going to turn Bengal into one of the wealthiest regions or wealthiest provinces of Mughal India. So, for instance, you have clearing of land to make it arable for different crops, and a variety of other economic activity, which is going to make Bengal one of the wealthier provinces of Mughal India. And certainly Mughal India was wealthier and arguably more prosperous than some of its contemporary kingdoms in Europe, for instance, such as Bourbon France. Excuse me, certainly on par with certainly on par or perhaps even higher in some respects than the contemporary Safavid and Ottoman empires as well. Sort of moving ahead quickly, now Mughal India is at its height, but certainly, let me make this point, but certainly it should be said that Mughal India by no means encompasses the entire Indian subcontinent that you will recognize today. However, it is at its height in around the 1680s under the Emperor Aurangzeb. Now, it is at its height, it is at its most powerful moment under Aurangzeb. Ironically, very soon though, ironically what Aurangzeb has done is that by trying to unify all these different and distinct independent quasi-independent regions of the Indian subcontinent under the rule of Mughal Delhi, he has spent far too much money and military strength in doing so. And ironically, he weakens this centralized system which the Mughals have created. And when he dies in 1707 of the Common Era, he leaves behind a weakened system, and his heirs begin to fight amongst themselves. And Mughal authority is now going to collapse very rapidly. Before we sort of get into Bengal, now one point we should mention, and this is going to be very fateful for not just the Indian subcontinent, well, for the Indian subcontinent and for Bengal, and that is going to be with the collapse of central rule from Delhi, the European powers which had been trading up to this point in the Indian subcontinent under the protection of the Mughal Empire or Mughal India, suddenly find that their security is no longer guaranteed, and it's at this moment they're going to take the very fateful decision and step, which is to start creating their own small bodies or corps of mercenaries, right? And I have given you the origins of that word, right? The Persian word sipahi, which translates into translates into soldier, and the anglicized version, which is going to be used by the British Empire, the sepoys, right? So these were trained mercenaries who were created by particularly the British and French empires in the Indian subcontinent to protect their economic assets, their business functions. However, what is going to happen is that increasingly, as Mughal central rule collapses, as the different regional areas of the Indian subcontinent begin to reassert or create their independent rule, what is going to happen is that the British and the French increasingly are going to use these mercenaries to interfere in the internal affairs of these kingdoms. Here is a picture of a French, a mercenary in the service of the French mercenary forces in the Indian subcontinent. Now, as we said, after the passing of Aurangzeb, the different regions of the Indian subcontinent, which had been provinces of Mughal Delhi, now begin to quietly reassert their independence. So in Bengal, which is the area that concerns us, Murshid Quli Khan, who was the chief financial administrator for the Mughals of the Bengal region, quietly detaches Bengal from direct rule, although they continue to pay lip service to the supreme authority of the Mughal emperor in Delhi. You still have Mughal emperors in Delhi, of course. It's just that their power and their authority are shrinking very rapidly. In other words, in terms of how much influence they have over proceedings in other parts of the Indian subcontinent. Now, Murshid Quli Khan was, by all accounts, a very capable administrator, completely reorganizes the system of governance in Bengal. You will be reading about the zamindari system during the age of the British Empire, but actually there is a different form, a beneficial form for Bengal, which is already in place, quite different from the British system, which is, for instance, in place in Bengal, and that was brought about by Murshid Quli Khan. Again, during his rule, right, he gives preference to ability, right, so there is no issue of leaving out people from the system of administration on religious grounds, for instance. And so Bengal continues to thrive in trade, including trade with the European powers. And the capital is established at Murshidabad, and hence you can call them the Nawabs of Murshidabad. So effectively from around 1710 until 1757, you basically have the Nawabs of Bengal who have reasserted Bengali independence once again. Let me mention one point briefly, which is that in 1717, the British Empire, or the British, or its arm, the British East India Trading Company, receives a license to trade directly with Bengal duty-free. The problem is that this license to trade duty-free only applied to the goods of the British East India Company. It did not apply to the goods purchased by individual officials of the British East India Company. And this point, keep in mind, is going to be one of the numerous problems which is going to come up in the tensions between Bengal and the British Empire leading up to the Battle of Plassey in June 1757. And in fact, Bengal revenue officials continuously have clashes with British officials of the East India Company for trying to evade Bengali taxes, right? So that issue, as I said, is going to come back in 1756, 1757. There are going to be two other Nawabs, briefly, Shujauddin and Sarfraz Khan, and then from 1740 onwards, you're going to have, looking at our next slide, from 1740 onwards, you're going to have the era of Alivardi Khan, a veteran administrator and military commander, and he is going to rule Bengal for the next 16 years. And his rule is difficult. It's marred by attacks from the neighboring Maratha kingdoms or the Maratha Confederation, such as from Nagpur. And there are, if you're familiar, there are poems, right? There are Bengali poems and stories about these raids which were carried out by the Maratha confederations. And in fact, in the early 1750s, Bengal even has to pay a huge indemnity to essentially pay off the Marathas to stop them from attacking Bengal. Despite this, despite these huge financial losses which are incurred by Bengal, Bengal continues to thrive. The trade with the Europeans is very lucrative. And Alivardi Khan is a very shrewd diplomat. As I said, he's a veteran administrator and politician. And he realizes that the Europeans are fighting amongst themselves in Europe, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But he doesn't want to get involved in these European conflicts. His only condition is that the British and the French must not militarily fortify their trading bases or missions in the Bengal region. That is the one condition that he has. And as long as he is the Nawab or ruler of Bengal, that is adhered to by both the British and the French. Now, he passes away in 1756. And his grandson, Siraj-ud-Dowla, now becomes the new ruler of Bengal. And it's also unusual that this transition happens without any war of succession, initially at least, and that tells you about the strength and resilience of Alivardi Khan's rule. However, the problem for Bengal and the Indian subcontinent is that the European powers are now about to encroach even more on the affairs of the Indian subcontinent, including, of course, Bengal. Now, what is happening, let me just talk about this briefly. Now, what has been happening, and I'll mention this briefly, is that before the year 1500 of the Common Era, you have a series of what scholars have called subsystems, right? So you have these various centers. They're based on the North African coast, on the East African coast, in South Asia, in the Mediterranean world, and of course in Europe. And so these independent subsystems trade with each other. It's not just about trade, it's the exchange of ideas and culture. However, once the European powers, beginning with the Spanish and Portuguese empires, once they start to carry out incursions and gradually the conquest of different areas, for instance, of the Americas, by the Spanish, first the Spanish and the Portuguese and the other European powers, the British, the French and the Dutch and others, including the Portuguese on the West African coast, for instance. Gradually what's going to happen, and the Portuguese destruction of independent East African city-states, for instance, on the East African coast, you're going to see the beginning of the destruction of the subsystems. In this slide, I talk about, again, there are a number of lucrative products and items which the European powers are primarily interested in. For instance, gold, diamonds, spices, perfumes, scented wood, sugar, and one of the reasons for this is that the European powers were concerned about the drain of gold and silver to these different subsystems to pay for these items. And that is an issue that we're going to come back to when we talk about the British system of exploitation during the era of the British Raj and the British East India Company in Bengal and the Indian subcontinent. And so what you're beginning to see is the destruction of the subsystems and the creation of what very influential scholars, as they have conceptualized the creation of the global world system, right? So the global world system, which begins to emerge in the years after 1500, is beginning to evolve at this time. And the principal European and Western powers, primarily the British and French empires, are fighting amongst themselves. And it's in this context, and here I have a slide. I'm not going to go, I sort of went through this. I'm not going to go through this again. So the British and the French empires come out as the leading contenders fighting for supremacy at the center of this new centralized world system. And it's in this context that they go to war with each other in 1756. And this has been called by military historians and scholars as essentially the first global war. So this is a fight to the death between the British and French empires. And now we can connect this to what's happening in Bengal. In the lead up to the Battle of Plassey, the British are going to violate their standing agreements with the new Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and that is going to lead to tensions. And that is when the British begin. And so Siraj-ud-Dowlah, goes without saying, is going to refuse to accept these violations of the standing treaties between Bengal and the British. And that is going to lead to open conflict that is going to lead us into the Battle of Plassey. All right, so this is sort of a short overview of the first lecture. All right. Thank you. And so the next lecture is going to cover the moment from the Battle of Plassey onwards. Thank you.